Hey everybody, and welcome to our final month of the Lady of Shalott project. Now you've already got your pieces cut out, you've got your applique sewn on, I know you've already got that done, and now it's time to just assemble the pieces together. And we're going to do that using truly one of my favorite quilting techniques. I call it no pins precision curved piecing. I'm going to be using one of the templates that has applique on it. I don't have any applique because I've already done my quilt, and one of the border pieces as well. Joining those two together will be the same as joining anything together in this quilt, so I'm going to show you how I put these together. To start with, I recommend that you put a regular foot. You don't need a 1/4 inch foot because we're not going to be sewing a 1/4 inch seam. I do not recommend an open toe foot just simply because the edges kind of tend to roll in. I'd rather just use my regular all-purpose #1 foot. Put the fabrics right sides together. As you can see, we've got the sharp point of this angle and the wide angle of this piece. I need to put those right sides together. And unlike traditional patchwork where you match up the edges, our goal is going to be to match just inside the stay stitching of the top one with just inside the stay stitching of the bottom one. And make sure that the right edge of the stay stitching is on top of the one below it. So I've got to do a little fiddling to make that happen. If you need to use a pin to point into that area, then so be it. That's not a problem. Once I've got a few stitches and my needle in the down position, my next goal is now to simply raise up the top piece, align the stay stitching with the one below, and stitch just a few stitches, stitching barely to the left of the stay stitching. Remember, the edge of your template was just inside the stay stitching by a breadth's distance, a tiny distance. So the distance you're sewing to the left is that same distance that you sewed from around the edge of the freezer paper. Now, as I approach the first registration mark, I want to make sure that the top and bottom, so I roll it back just to play peekaboo, and in this case it looks good. Align the stay stitching and start stitching again just a smidge to the left of the stay stitching. You will find that because when you trimmed this slightly less than 1/4 inch from the paper, you will not be accurate all the time. So we are not matching the edges of the fabric. We're simply matching the stay stitching and the registration mark as we sew. Notice I'm going slow. I'm continuing to play peekaboo. And in this case, I'm noticing that oh, there's not a registration mark here. I failed to mark that one, but I've got another one a little further down the way, and I feel that that's going to be just fine. You can see how a surprise it is if you don't mark all of your registration marks, and now you can understand how critical it is for these registration marks to be on the quilt. So I play peekaboo. Sure enough, they're going to match. I see they are. See how I use 2 fingers and just lift this up and lay it down? This is the reason I call this no pins precision curved piecing, is because if I pin this, I can't look in and see the alignment. And pinning really takes a long time anyway. So for those of you that are used to pinning, this will be a little bit strange, no doubt. But trust me, give this a try because I think you will find that it will be a really, really easy way to piece these curves very accurately. So again, I'm looking for the next stay stitch and continuing on down. This is the method you will use to sew all of the seams on this quilt. Just matching the registration marks and aligning the stay stitching. As I come to the end, I'm going to want this angle and this angle to basically lay right on top of each other so that when I finish this seam and open it up, the first thing I do is look to see how did that line up. And this stay stitching matches that stay stitching. I am very, very happy with how that looks right there. And then I swing it all the way to the other end because I want to see what it looked like at the beginning. And again, I'm very happy that this stay stitching now comes right into that stay stitching. If this was not aligned, I would pick out maybe an inch or two and just tug and reposition to make sure that these stay stitches line up. Then I kind of just tug onto the seam gently, looking in the seam to make sure that there is no stay stitching showing on the surface of the quilt. If I do see some stay stitching, I know that I have not taken a big enough bite on one of them. And if it's just a tiny bit of stay stitching, you could come and just take a little bigger bite on that seam. Otherwise, you may need to pick out 2 or 3 inches to get that better aligned. And when you look on the back side of the project, what you should be seeing now are 2 lines of stitching. You'll see the first line of stitching near the edge is the original stitch, and this new stitching is the seam. And so that's the distance that we had previously, and I'm trying to be as consistent as possible all the way down so that that looks really good. And then I take it to the iron and just give it a gentle press, trying not to distort anything. And it doesn't really matter which direction you press the seams. Just choose whichever seems to be best for your project. These are gentle curves and it should go together very easily. This is now how you do the piecing. Next, this is the piecing order. Take a look. As you're assembling the quilt top, there are going to be places on the quilt where you've got a lot of intersections coming together, and that is a place that, yes, I would pin that intersection. As a matter of fact, I would also stitch it with a larger stitch, like a 3.5 millimeter stitch, or at least a 3.0, and then if I open it up and everything looks good, then I can go back with a regular 2 millimeter stitch, and it will then be sewn together great. It's always easier to pick out bigger stitches, so sometimes whenever I'm fussing with some intersections, I might sew them first with a little bit larger stitch. That's just a tip. Once you've got the quilt, the top all together, then it's time to mark the quilting design. Now, the way I mark my quilting design is I use my Ricky Tim Stable Stuff poly. I copy the design. The quilting designs are on your pattern. I copy those on sections of the 8.5 by 11 sheets, at which time you then have to copy, overlap, and then cut to about a 1/2 inch overlap and use a glue stick to create those if they're larger pieces. Now, some of you know that we pre-ordered the option of having the full design. If you ordered the full design, you don't have to use the copy machine. Just cut out these designs and position them on your quilt. But if you're having to copy them one page at a time, one sheet at a time on the copier, then you'll just glue them together. And now, once you cut them out, turn the quilt top upside down. The seams will be facing you. This is the back of the quilt top, and you put the design on the place where it needs to go. You will then use a glue stick or a spray paste to get it secured in place. Then load your machine with water-soluble thread in the top and in the bobbin, and you're simply going to free motion machine quilt on top of those lines. The great thing about that is you're practicing quilting your quilt, and your bobbin thread is marking your quilt top very accurately. It's not a bad thing to be practicing quilting and marking your quilt at the same time. After you've got everything stitched on that quilt, if you flip it over to the front side, you can perfectly see all of the quilting design. Layer your sandwich with your backing and batting and your quilt top, and I recommend like an 80-20, 80% cotton, 20% poly batting, a nice thin batting. Baste it together. You can spray baste it with one of the spray adhesives. You can thread baste it, and if you do thread baste it, may I recommend that you thread baste it with water-soluble thread so that it will go away and you're not going to have to worry about pulling out any stitches later. After the quilt is entirely quilted, I usually go all the way around the edge of the quilt with a large and wide zigzag stitch, just for the simple fact that I'm going to now place it in my washing machine. I'm going to put it on a rinse and spin cycle, and I'm going to let it get wet. That's going to dissolve the water-soluble threads that I've used. That's going to make the stable stuff behind the applique and under the quilting get very soft. It will not dissolve. And then I'm going to take it out. I'm going to lay it on a flat surface, on a floor, on a table, whatever you can do. Lay it out flat, tug and pull till it's beautifully flat. Let it dry, air dry. And after that, that's when I take my straight edge and square up the quilt and bind it. On this quilt, I'm using a traditional binding, just a regular 1.75 inch wide strip to do a small little 1/4 inch binding to the front and flip it over to the back side. So that's what I'm doing on this quilt because that's the yardage that we have provided. If you needed a larger binding or had a different type that you wanted to do, you might have to use more fabric than you have in the actual leftovers of the quilt top. After you've got the quilt bound, then I put it back in the washing machine a second time. I do the rinse and spin, and I pull it out and I block it and make it perfectly square, let it air dry, and that's one of the reasons why when you see my quilts it shows I take great pride in knowing that they're going to be flat. It's frustrating because they sometimes have to get folded into boxes to go to the show, but a quilt can be very flat, and part of that process is by using the option to do the blocking as I've described. Now here's a little side note for you. Fabrics, whether they are commercial or hand-dyed, have the potential to bleed. Our fabrics have been washed and rinsed twice, so I expect them to behave properly. But in the event that you lay it out the first time to do its blocking, and as it dries you start noticing some bleeding, go ahead and bind the quilt, square it and bind it, and then put it back in the wash, but wash it in with Synthropol. Synthropol is a heavy concentrated detergent. You only need like 2 tablespoons to wash the entire quilt in. And Synthropol's job is to gobble up unbonded dye particles and take them away. I have had projects that have commercial fabrics and or hand-dyed fabrics that have bled in the past, and when I use Synthropol, it all washes away. I'm not addressing other techniques of like, there's a product called Retain that keeps it in the quilt. I don't want to keep it in the quilt because it's bleeding. I want to bring it out of the quilt. So just trust me on this. If you ever have any quilt project that you find that if you've put it in the water and immersed it, and you find that it's bleeding on you, then you can use some, you can heavily concentrate it in some certain areas like a pre-soak, and then wash that in the washing machine, and it will all come out. It's always come out for me if that has ever happened, and it's only happened on a few occasions. But I thought you might like to know that. Then that quilt is finished. It's beautiful. It's your Lady of Shalott quilt. I am so excited about all the amazing quilts that I've been seeing on this journey. Some of you have made it your own. Some of you have used different fabrics. Some of you have tweaked the design here and there, and that makes me very happy. And if you chose to make the design exactly the way I did, that makes me happy too, because we're making something fun. We're doing something that's memorable, and hopefully you've learned some fun new techniques along the way. So, this is the end of our Lady of Shalott project, and I can't wait for the next one to come. I hope you'll join me on that journey too. Till next time, see ya.